We are continuing in our Answers series, and the name of the lesson this morning is Jesus' First Signs. Jesus' First Signs. And if you recall, what Pastor Mackey discussed last week was the calling of the apostles, or the disciples that Jesus chose. And we're going to look at two things that immediately follow that event in the Gospel of John. And so on your handout here, or if you want to look there in your Bible, we have this first one in John chapter 2, starting in verse number 1. And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, They have no wine. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. After this he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. So we're going to be looking at 2 well-known events in Jesus' ministry. This is the first one, and the focus that I would like to put on them is more the why, more than simply the what, more than simply what happened. In fact, probably, I would imagine the great majority of us are quite familiar with the events that happen in both of these passages. Now, I'm also going to say that there's a lot of different ways a person could preach any given passage. I'm sure you could give Pastor Skeving this passage of the Scripture, and he could preach a sermon on it, and then the next week he'd come preach a different sermon on it, and he could do that 10 weeks in a row, the same passage, and give a different sermon every time. There's a lot of different things to draw out, right? And one of the ones that a person could talk about is talk about the Bible and alcohol, but that is not my intention for the lesson this morning. I will say on that the word that's used here for wine is the word oinos in Greek, and it can refer to new wine, which just means freshly squeezed grape juice. And this is even still common in English because you've probably heard of a wine press. And what do you get out of a wine press? You get grape juice out of a wine press if the grapes are fresh grapes. And so we still use some of that same terminology here. But if the grapes are fresh, the wine is non-alcoholic. That's all I'll really say about this morning. But let's turn to a few different things that we can gather from this passage. One thing that's interesting here that sometimes I think people overlook as they talk about this story in isolation, disconnected from what was talked about last week, which was the calling of the apostles, is what I have here as letter A. Jesus already had disciples before he performed any miracles. You notice that here in verse 2, it says, both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. This is about to be Jesus' first public miracle, but the disciples were already here. So we see from this, some people might think, of course Jesus would have disciples, right? I mean, when you go out and perform all these miracles, all these people are going to be flocking to you. But Jesus called the disciples before the miracles. The people were willing to follow him before that even happened, which is quite interesting. Last week, Pastor Mackey mentioned how Andrew told Peter, we have found the Messiah. We've found the Messiah. They didn't say that because of miracles he was doing, right? There was other reasons. And Philip told Nathanael, we have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write. Now you might say, well, what were the primary reasons that people had already chosen to follow Jesus, that these disciples were following him? Well, if you look just a bit before that in John, you'll see what John the Baptist had said, Behold the Lamb of God. And on John's testimony, remember what John had been called to do, to be a person to prepare the way before Jesus Christ. And it was clear from the New Testament he was quite effective in doing that. He sees Jesus Christ coming. He says, Behold the Lamb of God. And all of a sudden, people say, okay, John said this must be the Messiah. And of course, there's other things that Jesus did as he taught individually to these men and corporately to them that doubtless they could tell there's something different about this man. There's a whole history behind him. Some of these people had grown up around Jesus their lives and had seen quite clearly that something's different about this Jesus, and what John said no doubt confirmed that. So Jesus already had disciples before he performed any miracles. Letter B, though, to run out of wine was a huge faux pas. To run out of wine was a huge faux pas. It says in verse 3, when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, they have no wine. So a wedding in the Middle East is going to be a huge, expensive, multi-day affair. It's going to go on. Sometimes there's weddings that would last a whole week or even 2 weeks. This would be maybe the one time that if you had relatives who were quite a long ways away, if there was a wedding, they would come in from a long distance. And today you think, oh, okay, whatever, they'll jump on the plane and come here, right? It's a lot more difficult back then to go a long ways to somebody's wedding. You're going to be traveling perhaps for many days or even weeks just to get there. It's dangerous to travel. Most people in the Middle East didn't end up ever, and in fact the whole ancient world at that time would never really move. You'd never think about doing what Abraham did, get up and go to another country. Who would dare risk picking up your belongings and going through where anything can happen to you along the way? There's thieves, there's robbers, but during a wedding, people would make the exception and they'd travel a long way. So when you have guests show up at your wedding, you better treat them right. It's expected. It's not just like, oh, we kind of ran out. It's like this is the duty of care you have to the guests at the wedding. Provide them what they need to eat, provide them what they need to drink, and not just water. Make it an enjoyable time. To be able to have fresh grape juice would be an amazing thing to have around, and would be expected that they would serve something nice at the wedding. And so the groom actually has a social obligation here. So nowadays, if somebody runs out of something at a wedding, we might just kind of say, oh, that was a little embarrassing. But back then, people would be talking about that for weeks or years later, oh, that guy, the guy who ran out of wine at the wedding, and all the guests who had spent all this time to come here had to go out and get their own stuff. And so it was a big deal. It was not a minor thing to happen here. But letter C, notice how the story changes in its emphasis. Jesus' public ministry was always purposeful, leading to the cross, for letter C. Jesus' public ministry was always purposeful, leading to the cross. Now, Jesus says something that's a little bit cryptic to us here as we read in our 21st century, reading something translated in the 1600s from something written century before, where it says, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." So what Jesus is essentially saying here, to put it into modern English, Jesus is saying, ma'am, that would be the better way to say woman. When you see woman, today we might say ma'am, right? He wasn't being offensive or anything like that. Ma'am, what does this have to do with us? What does this have to do with us? And another interesting thing to note, of course, is whenever Jesus asks a question, right? Because Jesus knows the answers to the questions. So you always have to think what he's trying to imply to the person who is listening. But he's saying, what does this have to do with us? The Greek there, I talked to Brother Venom about this past week, is essentially, if you were just to directly translate each of the words over into English, it says, what to you and to me. What to you and to me. What does this have to do with us? And then he says this, mine hour is not yet come. Which means, if you're familiar with, especially when Jesus uses phrases like this in the Gospel of John, he means, it's not my time to die yet. And I have a few verses here below where you can see this. In John 7, verse 30, no man laid hands on him because his hour was not yet come. John 8:20, pretty similar, no man laid hands on him for his hour was not yet come. John 12:23, and Jesus answered them, saying, the hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. You can see what he's talking about there. Or in John 12:27, now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this cause came I unto this hour. And then it gets even clearer in the next two. In John 13:1, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And John 17:1, these words spake Jesus, and lifted up his eyes to heaven, and said, this is in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Father, the hour is come. Glorify thy Son, that thy Son also may glorify thee." So Jesus' ministry was always purposeful leading up to the cross. In other words, Jesus knew if he made a big deal right now, all right, they're out of wine. I'm going to go stand up on a stage, and in front of everybody, we're going to hold up a glass of water and pour it out, and they can watch me turn it to wine right now, make a big shebang about this, let everybody here in Cana know, and pretty soon everybody in Jerusalem will know. Jesus knew all things. He knew the future. He knew even what would happen, one of the things that we often question about. And he knew there were ways that he could do things that would hasten his death, and it was not his time to die. It was not time to make a big show and get everybody such in an uproar as it would be in the last week of his life, that they would say, let's execute this guy. He's a sorcerer or something like that. He had more things to do ahead of time. So what does this have to do with us that they've run out of wine here? It's not my time to make a big show and suddenly be put to death yet. That will come later. Now you might say, why would Jesus mention his death when Mary was running out of wine? And of course, the reason is that he would mention it to her is he's being honest with his mother. He's telling her, she had heard many years ago when Jesus was just a little infant baby boy about the future purpose for her son. And she knew some things that maybe even other people didn't know. And Jesus was cognizant of what was going to happen. And he wasn't going to use his power given from God for just anything. This is one thing people often kind of get mixed up about the miracles of Jesus. That Jesus, boy, he shows up and he's just doing a miracle here and there. Oh, they ran out of wine, so I'll just make some wine. And what we really find in the scripture is every miracle Jesus performs has a purpose, and he refuses to do a miracle if it's not the right time to do that. Jesus doesn't do gratuitous miracles. He's actually very precise with what he does. An example of that is Luke chapter 23, verses 8 and 9. "And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing." So later on, at the end of Jesus' life, Herod really wants to see a miracle, but Jesus doesn't give him one. And we see similar things, it seems to be, in the case with Pontius Pilate as well, where Jesus just stands before him. Now, what else do we see in this passage as we try to figure out a bit more of the why surrounding this event? Letter D, Mary pointed others to Jesus. Verse 5, "His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." So who knew better than Mary the wisdom of Jesus? Who had been the mother of a perfect child? Only Mary. She knew there's something different about my boy, Jesus. And so she said, okay, Jesus said, well, this isn't really our problem. And so she doesn't force him, tell him to do anything, but she just does what's the best thing to do in every situation. She turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you to do. Remember, this was 18 years after Jesus had already stumped the priests and teachers at the temple. Jesus' wisdom had well been known for quite a long time. And so Mary pointed others to Jesus. A good example for us to see when somebody talks about Mary, remember what Mary said and how she pointed people not to herself but to Jesus Christ. Then letter E, the servants are an example to us all of the value of complete obedience. Verse 7 says they filled them up to the brim. Now you could contrast the behavior of these servants at the wedding with Peter letting down the net, right? Jesus said, let down the nets. Peter lets down the net in complete obedience. We actually have a lot of examples of that in the Bible where God tells somebody or a prophet tells somebody to do something and they only obey partially. But in this case, because of their obedience, these servants got to witness something special. Now, this miracle at Cana is often called Jesus' first public miracle. But I don't think that this miracle was very public. I don't think it was very public. Number one, it's a private event. It is a wedding. It's for a certain set of guests. A lot of the later miracles Jesus will do will be out in crowds of people, out in general. But this is just a group of people. And actually, it seems like, most likely, This was either a relative of Jesus or a very close friend. If you think about it, you don't think of a lot of stories in the New Testament where Jesus and Mary are showing up together at some kind of event, but you find Jesus and Mary at this event here. It seems like it's somebody close to both of them, maybe a childhood friend of Jesus, maybe a close relative, but there's a limited group of people who are here. And also we note that Jesus didn't make a big show about it. You notice, as you see the way things happen, he told the servants to pour the water over there, and then they just noticed that it became wine. Jesus didn't stand up in front of everybody and say, hey, watch this. He performs the miracle, but he doesn't make a big show of it. And we're also told, particularly in this passage, that the governor of the feast didn't know of the miracle in verses 8 through 11. He didn't know about it. He's just served the wine, and he's surprised. He says, oh, you've saved the good wine till last. How surprising that this has happened. Now, remember, of course, to run out of wine is a very shameful thing. And especially if this is a close friend or relative of Jesus, Jesus is not going to want to embarrass the groom on his very own wedding day about the fact that they've just run out of wine. And Jesus had just told Mary that it wasn't his hour. He wasn't going to try to make a big show. He had a very good reason to perform this miracle quietly. And we'll see another evidence in a moment that perhaps this wasn't a very well-known miracle at the time. But the servants, they knew. We see in the passage, it says that the governor of the feast, he didn't know, but it said, but the servants knew. And so they, because of their complete obedience, received a blessing that many other people did not get to see. Letter F, when one's judgment isn't clouded by prejudice, Jesus is always better. Jesus is always better. Verse 10b says, thou hast kept the good wine until now. The governor of the feast thought he was judging wine. He didn't know that he was judging Jesus. And what you find a lot of times when we find people in the New Testament judging Jesus, they don't have a very neutral perspective on who he is. We find the Pharisees who have a vested interest in silencing any opposition to their religious system of things. But this guy, he didn't know what was going on. He just thought he was being served some more wine that was coming out to decide if it was fit enough to give to the guests. And they bring it out, and he judges it perfect. This is good wine. And he judged Jesus in the process without knowing it. And when a person does judge Jesus without being clouded about their preconceived ideas, he's always better. Perhaps this guy wouldn't have been so honest if he knew it came from Jesus. We don't know exactly who it is, but a lot of times a governor of the feast would be somebody who's responsible for making sure that everything was kept kosher, kept pure. You can't mix certain things. You've got to. This is somebody who may actually be a rabbi, and so this may be a person who knows at this early point in Jesus' ministry if he would have been biased against Jesus or not. But he wasn't in this case because he didn't even know. Now, one thing to note, though, is that he says that the wine is the best wine. You know, fermented wine in that time could be obtained at any time of the year. But pure, fresh wine, it's hard to get. It's only available at very particular times. It's the rarest, it's the most special kind. So when he says this is the best wine, that does give us a bit of an indication on that. The limited wine harvest season means that this is a special drink. And the amount of wine mentioned in verse 6 is about 2 bathtubs full that Jesus produces here. So this would certainly be sufficient for the rest of the wedding. Jesus was helping out, perhaps his childhood friend here. Now, letter G. Jesus' miracles had a purpose, manifestation. They tell who he is. In verse 11b, it says, and manifested forth his glory. Now, you may say, well, okay, so this was an extremely public thing, manifested forth his glory. But we'll see, because just because something is manifested forth doesn't mean it's manifested forth to everyone. Now, what I've done is I've highlighted a few passages here about the miracle-producing faith, and this is what we see in this passage. But look at some other examples. John chapter 4, come see a man which told me all things whichever I did, the miracle Jesus performed of knowing everything about this Samaritan woman. Is not this the Christ? And many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him. The miracle produced faith. John chapter 10, because that by reason of him, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. The him there being Lazarus. Lazarus raised from the dead, the miracle produced faith. Jews believed on Jesus. John chapter 2. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover and the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. The miracle produced faith. John chapter 4. As he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, thy son liveth. And then later on, he finds out it was the same time. And when Jesus said that, and it says at the end, himself believed and his whole house. The miracle produced faith. John 7:31, and many of the people believed on him and said, when Christ cometh, will he do more miracles than these which this man has done? The miracle produced faith. Now, as we think about the reason Jesus performs miracles, if it was simply to be a magical doctor, he did a poor job of it. Jesus could have healed a lot more people if that's what he really wanted to do. He could have turned a lot more water into wine if that's really what he wanted to do. Jesus didn't do these things just to be fancy and to just show things around, show off his power, to help people, to do people a favor. Jesus had a reason. And the real reason for the miracles was to authenticate his claim to be the Messiah and to cause others to believe that truth, and we find throughout the Bible that is quite effective in doing that. Letter H, it's one thing to be an intern for Jesus, it's another to believe on him. So we find in verse 11c, and his disciples believed on him. Jesus had called these disciples already, as we mentioned, and so they said, I'm going to follow this guy. This is a good teacher. I want to follow this teacher. I think that he's somebody really special. He may even be the Messiah. Did any of them even think possibly that he could be God at this point? Did they know who they were dealing with? But suddenly when the miracle happens, we see there's a change, that things are even more. His disciples believed on him. I believe that Jesus' manifestation in this case was primarily for the disciples. He's just called these disciples, he's giving them a special place, and they are some of the ones who are at first are going to see this miracle. They're now going to be prepared. They now believe on him fully, and so now as he is going to do more things in his ministry, he has a group of people behind him that are true believers. The idea of manifested from verse 11, that word manifested is the same word in John chapter 21 verse 1 that says showed. After these things Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise showed he himself. So in John 21:1, Jesus showed himself just to the disciples. And so in the same way, I believe in verse 11 where it says he manifested forth his glory, that doesn't mean it has to be to everyone. We know the disciples found out about it. We know the servants found out about it. We don't know if anybody else at the wedding ever even found out about it. The governor of the feast found out about it. At least not until a little bit later, right? When John writes this gospel, John is the last of the apostles alive. Decades are past. It reminds me of, for example, my dad or other pastors. They may talk about a church they pastored 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and they can tell some of those stories because that's in the past, right? Nobody really cares as much anymore about when it was in the heat of the moment. And so now John spills the beans. He said, by the way, you know, at Trevor's wedding, we ran out of wine. Everybody, oh, that's kind of funny, ha, ha, ha. John reveals it here in his gospel about the water to wine. By the way, John's the only gospel where this story is told. And perhaps this is when the beans were spilled publicly for the first time on this slightly embarrassing event. But nevertheless, notice, the disciples, they were interns for Jesus, but now they were true believers, and it made quite a difference. And so that's one of the really important things to see from the wedding at Cana. We could say a lot more, but Pastor Mackey gave me this lesson, and there's 2 stories in it, so we've got to move on. Turn to page 3, and let's look at the second one. John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now this story is essentially told only in the Gospel of John. Now, the other three Gospels do tell a story of the cleansing of the temple, but that story is told at the end of his ministry, which makes it apparent that he did this at least twice, maybe more than that. We don't know how many times that he did it. But the story being told here at the beginning of his ministry is only mentioned in the Gospel of John. Now, some people have actually claimed that John is not chronological, but there's actually plenty of evidence that that's not the case, that this is a second different event. And some of the evidence for that is in both the cases mentioned in the other three Gospels and in the case here in John, there is clear language near the beginning and end of those stories tying it to other events at the time. It doesn't just say things broken apart. It then says things like after this or indicating that it's connected to the thing before it. Also, what we just read in verses 18 and 19, where Jesus answered the Jews, they said, "What sign do you show to us?" And Jesus said, "Destroy this temple." If he says this right after cleansing the temple, we find out in the Gospel of John and the other Gospels, later on, the Pharisees continue to bring this up and say, Jesus said he was going to destroy the temple. They mention this later on. So it was apparent that they knew about that at the beginning of his ministry. This wasn't something that happened at the end, otherwise Jesus hadn't said this yet. But he had said it. He said that right near the beginning of the ministry about destroy this temple. They misunderstood what he was even talking about, and they like to bring it up later on. So it's pretty clear. It's chronological, and this is an event that happens at the beginning of his ministry. Now, why did Jesus cleanse the temple? Number one, it needed cleansing, and nobody else was doing it. It needed cleansing. Nobody else was doing it. There were multiple dishonest and exploitative practices that were happening in the temple. And among these, there was charging exorbitant exchange fees. The temple had its own currency, not to mention the fact that Jerusalem would have its currency. A lot of times currency is not nearly as much standardized as it is today. And the whole Roman Empire, in various parts where people might be coming at this time, around the time of the Passover, people would come with all different currencies. So they were showing up with different currencies. Everybody has to exchange. What a good time when nobody really knows the value of the money anyway, to just rip them off and charge way more than they are supposed to pay. And they were also inflating the price of sacrificial animals. Now you might say, why do people need to buy animals at all? You would think, and if you look at the Old Testament, people bringing these animals, what are you supposed to bring? You're supposed to bring your best animal, your best sheep, or dove if you don't have enough money. You're supposed to bring that to offer as a sacrifice. And so you just assume everybody would bring one. But if you're traveling a long way, you really can't bring very much. If you're going to travel a long distance to come to the temple, maybe people from the local area could feel like they could do that. But people coming for a particular time of the year, coming from a long distance for Passover, that something could happen. You bring in your best lamb and out jumps something or it scratches itself. It disqualifies itself. It makes a mess. So you really didn't have much an opportunity to bring it. Not to mention, the Pharisees at the temple had some good things going for them. Number one, they would have people who would raise the sheep, and then they would pre-approve these animals that were sold. Everything that was sold there in the temple, this is already approved. It's already been looked at by a rabbi. It's already said it's the best. No need to worry about anything else. If you show up and you did bring your animal, all right, it's time for the inspection. And who's got kind of a deal with the guys there at the temple to make sure that they sell enough animals? No, this isn't a good enough lamb. Look at this here and this here. Nope, you're going to have to buy one of ours instead. And the people were very familiar with this. They knew what was going on. And they knew the temple was a mess. They were being ripped off, and they didn't respect those in charge. And you can see this. There's lots of hints about that all throughout the Gospels about, they saw that Jesus had authority, not as the scribes. And one of the reasons that people went to Jesus so much is, of course, plenty of reasons to go to him. But one is that the alternatives were so terrible as well. If you're looking for a religious teacher, they saw so much complicity in dishonesty. The temple leaders were viewed as snobbish elites and complicit in everything that was happening there. So it needed cleansing, though. What was going on there was dishonest, and all the other religious leaders just kind of turned a blind eye or took some money under the table. Number two, Jesus, more than anyone, was passionate about God's house. Notice that sometimes people will say, boy, why did Jesus get so angry? Why did Jesus get mad? Did Jesus kind of fly off the handle? But notice the only emotion actually mentioned in this passage is zeal, not anger. It does not say that Jesus was angry. It said that he had zeal, and it was not impulsive, what he was doing here. This was planned and justified. Jesus didn't just do this oh man, what's happening here? I haven't ever seen this before. Jesus knew it had been happening all this time. He had had this time prepared in his mind, and he knew that it was now time to cleanse the temple, and he was passionate about God's house. Who has the most rights out of anybody, ultimately, to do something like this? You may say, oh, who's Jesus to come in and just start flipping tables in the temple? Well, you know what? This was Jesus' temple. This was a temple to Jesus. Jesus is God. This was God's temple. This is his place. Who has more right than anyone to come in and say, this is not the way the temple is going to be run? And so Jesus came in. He was more passionate than anyone, and he cleansed the temple. Number 3, Jesus established credibility with the people. Later on, Jesus was going to say things to claim to be God. And if Jesus was going to claim to be God, people would wonder, if God is really here, why is God letting this stuff go on at the temple down there? Why is the temple being mistreated? And God is right here and he's doing nothing about it. And maybe it would be a thing that a person wouldn't even think about at the time, but when they see Jesus cleanse the temple, they'd say, yeah, that kind of seems like something God would do if he was here. You know, I didn't think about that. If I was just a person pretending to be God, maybe I wouldn't have went down to do that. But now seeing Jesus do it, it's like, yeah, that's something God would really do if God was here. He was establishing credibility with the people. This is the way that God would behave. Now, in contrast, this isn't all that much later from the last miracle we saw, but in contrast from that one, Jesus is doing this one very, very publicly. At the most public place, with the people who are the most well-known in the city, the people with the most authority, all there. On the most important time of the year, when everybody is around, during Passover, it's mentioned at verse 13. Busiest time of the year for Jerusalem. The place is Jerusalem. He's not off in some little city somewhere else. Hundreds of thousands of people were going to converge on Jerusalem from all around, from Israel and other countries. There was lots of sacrifices, lots of selling. There would be lots of notoriety that was going to happen from this event. And in verse 17, the disciples make the connection to the messianic prophecy of Psalm 69, verse 9. Which says, for the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproach thee are fallen upon me. You can see that it mentions that they remembered that in verse number 17, that same messianic prophecy. So he's, again, providing credibility before the disciples themselves. And they're saying, the thing Jesus is doing right now looks just like this Bible passage, and this Bible passage is talking about the Messiah. Now we do have here, if you've everybody kind of gets an idea in their mind when you hear a story about what things look like. Well, here's what they really looked like, is Herod's temple, it's called. In the middle there is really what you think about when you think about the temple. This whole big structure on the outside is more like the Temple Mount. And you can see that is the kind of stuff that Herod really put his effort into making, to make this huge outer Gentiles courtyard. The regular Jews, the regular Israelites could not go into that little temple building proper, which is not really that little. It looks little in this picture, but the temple building proper, that's just for the priests, right? And part of it just for the high priests. And only the men could get up to a certain part in front of it. And then there's even a place behind that that's for the women. And then this whole outside section is for anybody who's not a Jew, but also just anybody can be there. It's not just for Gentiles. And so in that Gentiles courtyard, that's where you could set up a bunch of shops. And you could start to do the exchanging and have the animals. And so the buying and selling would have happened in this massive Gentiles courtyard. And a funny thing about this, or maybe it's funny, it's interesting to think about, you know, the Jews, they're very passionate about this temple. And when Jesus says, speaking of his body, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up, you know, they're kind of upset about this. You know, this is Herod's temple. This great guy Herod, he came in and he made this temple really nice for us to appease us. Who is this Herod? You know, Herod is like a title, kind of like you might say Pharaoh is a title. There's a lot of Herods mentioned, and they're not all the same guy. Who's this Herod? Who's the Herod who made this temple nice? It's that Herod who, when Jesus was born, said, send in and kill every baby in Bethlehem. That's this guy that they're really talking big to Jesus. Herod, build us this great temple, and you want to tear it down? You know that Herod, the guy who tried to kill you when you were a child? This was their temple. This was the guy who had made it all fancy for them, Herod the Great. And that work had actually happened in building this temple from about 20 to 10 years possibly before Jesus was born is when the temple had been made nice like this. And it wasn't the complete, this temple was still, there were some things carried over from before Herod's time, but Herod really made it much nicer. And the Jews, they really liked this Herod's temple. Well, number 4, it had been foretold that Messiah would suddenly come to his temple. Malachi 3:1, "Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts." Jesus, throughout all of the Gospels, you'll find him fulfilling one prophecy after another, one messianic prophecy after another, until the time we finally get to it when it says that Jesus had seen that all things had been accomplished. When all things had been accomplished, that was when Jesus could die. But there was a lot to accomplish, and this was one of them, coming suddenly to his temple from Malachi chapter 3. So Jesus fulfills that prophecy here. Reason number 5, Jesus was foreshadowing a disruption in the temple system of things. And in fact, the temple system had already been disrupted. It had already been disrupted. You know, God was no longer specially present there. We read about in the Old Testament about, people coming up and touching the ark and dying, about there being everything very special about God's presence between the cherubim. Well, you know what? There was no Ark of the Covenant in this temple. That had been long gone. There was no more presence of God at this temple. And we read about the event when that happened back in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 10, verses 18 and 19. "Then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubims. And the cherubims lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. And when they went out, the wheels also were beside them. And every one stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of the God of Israel was over them above." In this prophetic mention in the book of Ezekiel, we see the story about what happened and how ultimately God's presence left that temple. There was no presence of God here anymore. And so the Old Testament way of doing things, about bringing your offering to the temple, it was already well on its way to being done. Now Jesus, his cleansing of the temple, what does this mean? Well, if people couldn't bring their own animals easily, almost everybody was bringing their animals. It's Passover, it's the busiest time of the year. Jesus comes in and he kicks all these people out. He's breaking this chain of things. There are people doubtless standing in line. It says he chased off the buyers and the sellers. And so all of a sudden, everything's thrown out of order. He's flipping the tables of the money. This is going to take some time to happen. Here's the priests. They've got really good at doing things quickly. They're offering the offerings. And it's time for the next offering to come up, and Jesus has messed up the order of things. He's thrown everybody out. Ask the Levite, bring the next offering in here to offer it. Oh, we don't have one. There's some chaos going out there. The animals are all running away. And Jesus has stopped what has been happening here at this temple. All of a sudden, the sacrifices that were happening one after another have stopped. His cleansing of the temple stops for an hour, perhaps, the sacrifices that were being made. But in just a few short years, Jesus would be stopping the need for these sacrifices to happen forever. In just a few short years, it would no longer be necessary to bring any animal sacrifices until the end of the age. And we read in Hebrews chapter 10, "And every priest standeth daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God." So Jesus Christ was going to shut down the temple for much longer than just an hour. He was going to put an end to the necessity of offering of animals with his blood once and for all. And we also read in Ezekiel chapter 40 about a future temple. Some people call it the millennial temple, after the millennium in which it will be present. That Christ's cleansing of the temple could even foreshadow this temple in at least one way, which is quite interesting here. Zechariah 14 tells us about the end of the age. It says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south." So this is the return of Christ. And what's going to happen to the temple when Christ comes back and ultimately the millennium is established? Zechariah 14:21, "Yea, every pont in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts. And all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe therein. And in that day there shall be no Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. No Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. Interesting. What does that mean? You know what Canaanite means? Of course it can mean an ethnic group of people. But the word Canaanite was used in the Hebrew language as a stand-in for a trader, a seller, a person who would trade goods, because these people often did that job. Just like an Israelite, you'd almost expect to be somebody who had sheep. A Canaanite was somebody who was a trader. And we find, and here's two other passages in the Old Testament where we find this word that's Canaanite. If you look it up in the Hebrew, it's the word for Canaanite, and it's translated merchant. Proverbs 31:24. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the Canaanite. But in the King James, it's merchant, because that's what it's talking about. Job 41:6. Shall the companions make a banquet of him? Shall they part him among the merchants? It's the word for Canaanite. So take that understanding into Zechariah 14:21 tells us in the millennial temple, there will not be any merchants there. And Jesus chased the merchants out of the temple here, and he says, I'm making the temple now like it's going to be that day. No buying and selling. Everybody can come freely into the temple in that day. There'll be no buying and selling, no merchant in the house of the Lord. And finally, as we come to a close here, although I do have more, but not the time to share it all with you, Jesus drew attention to the more important temple. Jesus was going to bring in the reality that the temple pointed to. We see this in verses 19 through 22 of the passage. Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. The temple, like everything on earth, was only temporary. These sacrifices there were pointing to Jesus' once-for-all sacrifice. And the religious system was so ingrained in the people, just following this set of laws and forgetting why they had even been created and what they pointed to, that they missed the reality. Jesus the Messiah was here. A very interesting thing that Jesus makes this parallel here. They're all looking at this temple, and he says, what about this temple, the temple of my body? Here you are looking at this shadow, looking at this temple with its sacrifices that can never take away sins, that are only supposed to cover the sins until the time the Messiah comes. And here comes the Messiah into his temple, the one who can actually take away sins, and you're so focused on the shadow that you don't even see the real thing. I've seen people mention an illustration of the idea of a person who they have a dog, and they want to tell the dog, as they're training it, to go get something, and they point at what to look at, and the dog sees their finger and is jumping up and grabbing at the finger. He doesn't understand what he's supposed to be looking at. He just looks at what's pointing. And the temple was just pointing to Jesus Christ. And the Jews were so obsessed with the temple that they ignored what it was pointing to, Jesus Christ, when he was really there. So Jesus said, let's disrupt this temple. Let's talk about the real temple. Let's talk about what's really going on here, and drew attention to what was far more important. And so let's keep these things in mind as we remember these two stories. There's some interesting things that you can continue to study on them. Jesus refers to his purpose in both cases. He refers to his death in both cases. These are things that happened early on in his ministry, recorded only in this one Gospel of John, which is a gospel meant particularly to talk about how Jesus is God. And I think John did a very good job in showing this here to us, and seeing how Jesus, at the very beginning of his ministry, is already showing himself, setting himself up as God. For those who want to claim anything else, you have to overlook an awful lot that's been told here in this story. I pray that the Lord will continue to help us each as we study these passages to see what he really has for us in